yeah, that way. All right. For you to also know who stands behind the organization of this event, I will quickly introduce the four of us. So Sarah and Alexandra from the Basis Latin America Committee will be managing the chat and the technicalities of this event. The first half of the panel will be moderated by me and the second by Lina. We're all students at Leiden University. Sarah, Alexandra, and I are doing our bachelor in international studies, and Lina is currently writing her master thesis in Latin American studies. Now, finally, I would like to proceed by introducing our three speakers, Laura, Fabio, and Dr. Solheim. Let's start with Laura. Laura Marcela Zuñiga is a master's student of Peace and Conflict Studies at the Otto von Guericke Universität of Magdeburg in Germany. Laura has worked on topics such as rebel governance, transitional justice, and the relationship between organized crime and peace building in Colombia, Mozambique, Yemen, and Kosovo. Currently, Laura is working as a country expert for the project Armed Governance at the University of Arizona. Welcome, Laura. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Then we have present with us today Fabio Díaz Pabón. Fabio is a researcher at the African Center for Excellence in Inequality Research at the Southern African Labor Development Research Unit and a research associate at the Department of Political and International Studies at Rhodes University in South Africa. His research focuses on the intersection between theory and practice in regards to economics, politics, inequality, development, and conflict. Welcome, Fabio. Thank you for joining.
Hi, welcome. Thank you.
Last but not least, we're joined by Dr. Håvar Solheim. Dr. Solheim is an assistant professor at the Institute for History at Leiden University. His research focuses on security management in urban Latin America, and he analyzes public safety and the law in the Latin American city, as well as how trust and legitimacy are built and maintained in the eyes of the citizens. Bienvenidas y muchas gracias. Welcome and thank you for joining our panel today. So one more thing before we start and dive into our discussion. In light of time, we decided to give each panelist about 3 minutes for each answer. But yeah, I will just keep track of the time, so you don't have to worry too much about that. Okay, to dive into the subject, I would like to start off by establishing some historical context and take a closer look at protests that have preceded the current national uprising, because what we see in the streets of Colombia today remind of the protests in 2019 against the government after President Duque had proposed to cut in pensions. But it was certainly more than that, as well as today, as the Duque government has also been very slow, to say the least, in implementing the peace accords. So I would like to ask Laura. Laura, do you see a correlation between the protests of 2019 and the large discontent of the Colombian population that is unfolding in the streets today?
Thank you. Just to clarify, 3 minutes for the answer, right? So I have to be very brief. I had prepared a couple of points. I'm just going to focus on maybe 2 or 3. I wouldn't say there's a correlation. I would say this the same movement, right? But the protests that we're seeing and the social unrest and the political upheaval that we are seeing in 2021 is just the aggravated consequences of the national strike that started in November 2019. It was a terrible year for everybody, for the government, for Duque's government, and also for civil society, because you could also say that for 2018 and 2017, but 2019 was the year in which we witnessed the direct consequences of the failure of the implementation of the peace agreement in many, many realms. So as you mentioned, the Duque's administration was reluctant to fully implement key points of the peace agreement. Indeed, the president ran a campaign opposing publicly to the agreement. And right when he entered office, he opposed the statutory law for the transitional justice system. He was just attacking the process in several attempts. Then we also saw this renewal in security policy in which the government he increased the expenditure in security, and he proposed this the renewal of forced eradication programs, which was also going against one of the points in the agreement in which it was trying to, these caucus substitution programs were trying to give a legal alternative for the populations that are relying economically on that. And apart from that, we had a renewal in violence. So I think, as many of you already know, this year we saw an increase in waves of violence against indigenous communities, against Afro-Colombian communities, against communal leaders, human rights and environmental activists, and also signatories of the peace agreement, violence against ex-combatants. So civil society had this perception of we are being killed. The state is not fulfilling the process of providing security. The state is going against the transitional justice process. And also we have to mention that during that year and even before, we saw emblematic defections on the FARC side. So we have this creation of new dissident fronts, also a lot of political scandals regarding the FARC participation in Congress. So there's a lot of junctures that come into one place. And if you add on top of that, that Colombia historically is a highly unequal country, we're the second most unequal country in Latin America and the 8th worldwide. And the levels of poverty were almost half of the population. So, and then we add the student protest, but I guess we will talk about that in a couple of seconds. But you have this social upheaval, this social dissent, and then people go to the streets. And although the protests in that year, they were not encountered with the same level of violence that we are seeing now. The discourse that the state undertake was kind of the same. So there's this dynamic of the government trying to criminalize the social protest, labeling social movement, labeling demonstrators, labeling protestants as low intense urban terrorism, or saying that the protests are systematically infiltrated. So that opens a window of opportunity for police violence and for all things that we're seeing now. So just to wrap it up, the peace agreement was, or the not compliance with the peace agreement and the violence against social leaders and the defunding of the public education and many things just came together for the declaration of the national strike in November in 2019. Protests continued until February 2020, but they were disrupted because of the arrival of COVID. And now after that, you already know the story.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. Yeah, we will definitely speak about the violence that we see unfolding on the streets today a bit later, and also on the discourse that the government shapes about different social groups. I would like to now move a little bit forward from 2019 to April 2021 and ask Fabio what has happened recently prior to April 28, if you can maybe summarize that a little bit, if the tax reform was only the straw that broke the camel's back, as you've posted so accurately in one of your articles, and maybe what role does the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, play in that as well?
Yeah, so I think there's a series of elements that got mixed in a particular period of time, that is the time of the pandemic. As Laura was presenting before, like there were like a series of grievances taking place along the expectation that the state was going to become more democratic with the possibility of peace in the middle of an ongoing series of armed conflicts with drug traffickers, spoiler groups, paramilitary groups, and elites who still use violence in some cases to maintain their privileges in Colombia. So that's the setting, right? So people started to mobilize in 2019 with more strength, but that was coming since 2016 as the door kind of like slightly open for democratic participation due to the promises of the peace agreement. There was the expectation within civil society and all those communities that have been at the receiving end of violence in Colombia, that there were some promises to enter and be recognized and accepted in the states as full citizens, right? So that was the background. Then, like when the pandemic struck, Colombia had like has a big issue similar to Latin America, and it's that informality is extremely high. So that means for more than half of the people that has a job in Colombia, they go to the street and find daily bread every day into the streets, right? That in addition to a high percentage of the population that is officially employed but doesn't have health coverage, social pension, and so on. So we have like a big component of the population that was exposed to lose their jobs if the economy closed. And Colombia implemented one of the most strict lockdowns in the world. So if your way of living was going to the street, trying to sell some fruits in the street or an orange juice or these kind of things that you see in Colombian cities all the time, and the police is in charge of enforcing you that you cannot feed yourself, it is impossible to expect that as a society that is starving to death will sit and will just comply with this. In addition to this, the police force implemented a lot of these measures with a lot of force. We have to remember that not only the transition to a new government brought like a right-wing politician into government, but a dramatic change in the military forces that have become politicized. And I'm talking about the army and the police forces, which are more keen to follow the ideologies of the right-wing sector in Colombia rather than working for the state. And that mindset has informed the actions of policemen and military forces, which in addition to the lack of leadership of the current government, explains why there's still abuses against citizens after 1 month. One thing is that there's an accident that happens in the spaces of tension, but another thing is that this keeps happening consistently with civilians next to police officers, shooting at other civilians or people in plain clothes with rifles, with guns, shooting at civilians, and police officers taking pictures of them behind them. I'm not joking. So that is extremely problematic because that relates a little bit to what Solheim does, and the issue of legitimacy gets extremely compromised in Colombia. And in that case, that explains the anger and the frustration of the population and this outburst that is taking place.
Yeah, thank you, Fabio. Yeah, I would like to continue with the next question, actually, for Dr. Solheim. So the escalation of the protests we've seen, especially in the Cauca region and Cali, can you reason why Cali has been the heart of the uprising?
Yeah, can you all hear me? Perfect. Cali, well, it is part of this national paro nacional, but the thing that makes it so caliente, as they say in Cali, is obviously there is a number of issues here that come together. First of all, obviously they're fed up with a lack from the national and local government. It's been ongoing for many years, particularly, and this is the dramatic thing with Cali. Should be positive, but in these times we see that Cali has become so hot zone for insecurity due to they have a really high level, high part of the population are very young. And the lack of, particularly the lack of future, the lack of being able to take education, being able to prepare themselves for a working life, and afterwards there is also lack of job, has become a really frustrating thing, and this has just added only to the simple fact that the young in Cali have taken to the streets, right? They don't have any future hope that things will become better. And what we also see is the Colombian economy has driven also very forward this part, and what will happen if these protests continue, and the government denies sitting down on the table, and start negotiating, because what they're doing now is just a game, just to prolong the protests until they go home, right? Because at the end of the day, they think, well, people need to start working again to earn money. So you have these, the part of this social explosion that happened was that the great majority of Cali citizens are very young. So in that sense, they lack that possibility for the future. At least that is their perception at this moment. Then you also have a very poor management that Fabio mentioned a little bit, and also Laura, about the pandemic. A total lockdown in a country where more than half of the working people work in the informal sector, and then they need to go home if they have a home, and they suffer police abuse, police harassment, police aggressiveness if they try to earn a living, because it's the only way they have to put food on their table and for their children. Well, that also is a part of it, and it just increases and increases. That's this bubble, this social bubble, this cocktail, Molotov cocktail that has all these ingredients. Then in Cali, you also have a mayor, and he's currently, I don't know if they launched an investigation, but he's been accused of corruption lately, and this has also been dedicated money that they could have dedicated to the corona pandemic. They have spent on a lot of strange public appearances, and that has only made everything start to boil, right? You also have in Cali, it's a really important city where you have from the regions around, they come to Cali to gather a strong amount of social movements, all kinds of social movements, also participating in the protests, and that makes it even larger. The masses of people on the streets are really impressive to see, and you can't, if you look at the picture from above that they have been filming and monitor, you can't even see the asphalt any longer. So there is a lot of people coming also from around into Cali, obviously, to protest, because it's an important city, it's an important financial and political center, and that is also where the protests most likely will be heard, along with Medellin, and particularly then the political center, Bogota. But first and foremost, it is obviously got to do with the fact that demographically, they have a very young generation coming up, and they are really not trying to push through change that is very, very much needed. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Solheim. I would like us to stay a little bit in the Cauca region. So in October 2020, the Minga, a conglomerate of Colombian indigenous nations, took on a march from the Cauca to the capital, Bogota, to confront the president about the ongoing massacres of their leaders, as you probably know. So according to Indepaz, the year 2020 was the most violent in Colombia since the peace agreement was signed in November 2016, with widespread attacks on social activists, trade unionists, and former guerrillas in the peace process. Yet in the national discourse, the Minga tends to be portrayed as guerrillas or terrorists. So, Laura, I would like to ask you, what is the role of the Minga in the current protests? And perhaps you can share some knowledge about the portrayal of the Minga in the national discourse as well.
Yes, okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. I would change the question of what can be the role of the Minga, because right now they're not officially accepted in the negotiations with the state. So just as like little context for all the internationals that are hearing us here, Minga is a word that comes from Quechua. Minca, Quechua is a family of indigenous languages that means the gathering of people, the gathering of knowledge, and the gathering of skills in the pursuit of a common goal, So it's a quite widespread and abstract meaning. Like the goal today could be the construction of a bridge. the goal tomorrow could be we gather together and we're gonna make a lunch. So everyone gives whatever they have. But in recent context and in context of this protest, the Minga, and historically also the Minga has meant social fight for the reivindication of human rights and fight for the reivindication of indigenous rights, right? Civil resistance. And we have to say that the indigenous communities, the Minga Indígena, especially in Cauca, when they mobilize a lot of people, and they are quite organized politically and socially when it comes to protest. They already mobilized resources back in 2008 when former President Álvaro Uribe Vélez was pursuing a strategy of military confrontation with armed groups. They also mobilized a lot of resources in the national strikes that took place in 2013 in this agricultural strike where people in the countryside were protesting because the loss of the food sovereignty and also the human solidarity that came along. It was also a huge protest that we witnessed at that time. And as you mentioned, last year, they mobilized 8,000 indigenous to Bogota to demand the president didn't want to sit with the guerrillas because of the danger of a terrorist attack and all the discourses that we already know. And what it is important here, what I would like to recall here is that the potential that the Minga has as a mediator for conflict and as a source of de-escalation of a conflict. So there's this indigenous Guardia Indígena, I'm pretty sure that you have heard of. This is some sort of an institution of civil resistance, like a promotion of human rights protection in the protest. So, and they could actually help the protest right now to de-escalate violent confrontations between protesters and police. And the powerful thing about the Minga Indígena is that if they are articulated within the broader negotiations within the government, they can join and articulate all the sectors that don't feel recognized or represented with the national committee, the National Strike Committee, Comité Nacional del Paro. The problem with this committee is that it's composed of more than 300 organizations around the country, and it's this monster that we don't know if it has a head, and we don't know if all the sectors feel represented, like civil society feel represented by this actor. And the Minga could actually help to mediate within the government. In Cali happened something quite interesting, and I'm interested to know what the commentators have to say about that. When the Minga Indígena tried to enter the city, and they were met with armed resistance by civilians in some of the districts, and they were actually gonna go to Cali for humanitarian reasons because of Puerto Resistencia. There's this neighborhood in Cali that have been the focus of many armed confrontations between demonstrators and police. They were there to fulfill humanitarian reasons, to de-escalate the conflict, to be the watchers of non-violence. But unfortunately, they were met with violence with some sectors in Cali. And unfortunately, the government hasn't had recognized them as a powerful source for recognition and for negotiation, and that's because for me it represents a threat to the government, because what the Minga Indígena is demanding is the same thing that they have been demanding decades ago. They have been demanding the implementation of the peace agreement. They have been demanding more protection for the territory. They have been demanding more environmental protection, human rights protection, not only for his communities, but we can see that there are some common goals between what they are demanding and things that are universal, the things that can be that can identify all Colombians. But the problem is, as many of you have said, is that the government don't want to negotiate now. They are still waiting. They are kind of relenting the process in the hope that the social process is just gonna decompose from one week and another. But as we're seeing now, it's not the case.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. Fabio or Dr. Solheim, would you like to respond to that, particularly to the role of the Minga, or how you perceive it?
Well, I think I'll add to it because there's already like a quite good and clear exposition from Laura. But the first thing that we need to take into account is that the indigenous groups and the mobilizations labeled as Minga have been taking place in the last decade. So, and it is important to make clear that they have been opposing armed violence from any actor who uses violence against civilians or indigenous groups. So there's accounts of indigenous groups going to guerrillas and say, like, go out of here, we don't want you here. There's accounts of indigenous groups going to the army and saying, go out of here. And they actually tell them, go and play somewhere else, you guys. You want to play? Fight somewhere else, but not in our house. So, and it has been quite like an encouraging exercise of civil disobedience against the violence pushed by certain actors, right? But we need to take into account that in spite of the strength of these organizations that have consolidated themselves before and after the 1991 Constitution that gave them the political space to be recognized as entities that had like some degree of power versus the state, to talk to the state as representatives of the populations, of indigenous groups and Afro-descendants. That's another really important group. Colombia has deep issues of racism. In spite that we might seem that we are mixed and our skin color might show different tones of cinnamon colors or however you want to call it, there's issues of racism. And in Spanish, for example, if you, like the word indigenous is usually used in a derogatory term. But with the mobilizations and the shifts that have been taking place in Colombia, that notion has started to shift quite interestingly. So when you see how indigenous people is received when they join protests to support protestors, it's pretty much like they receive them as heroes. That didn't happen before. And they have earned that through sheer effort and resistance against violence without exerting violence, which is remarkable. You know, it could be like perhaps the Latin American version of Gandhi's resistance, if we want to call it as such. And because of that, I think like the indigenous groups, for an important sector of the population in Colombia, they are the ones who have nourished that spirit of resistance. And that's why they're so important. And there's also like the recentering of the country around political symbols and statues that they're throwing down of colonizers, genocidal colonizers, is happening now. But that's not happening with everyone in the country. So on the one side, we have like a lot of people who recognize the value of what indigenous groups have, the legitimacy that they might have with protesters to deter them to fight against the police. But they don't have that legitimacy within the government. Because if we want to understand this problem, we need to understand what is the ideology behind those in power and opposing the government. And unfortunately, the ideology behind the government is not even something theoretically solid, it's hollow. It is tainted by degrees of racism. It is tainted by ideas of conspiracy theories, the whole idea that Colombia is going to become a communist dystopia, that in Spanish they call it Castro-Chavismo, like it's like a monster, like Godzilla or something like that. That is ridiculous. And the problem is that the government says these things in Colombia, but when they go overseas, if they speak in the Netherlands, if they speak in the UN, they won't do that. They know we use different channels of communication. So they go in the UN and they quote Mandela, but in Colombia, they don't do anything forward to move the peace agreements. So they just are able to keep face, but thanks to social media, that is disrupting a little bit that idea of channeling different discourses to different audiences. But I think it is important to understand how can that happen, if it can happen with the current government, or if in fact we actually have to think if this is a process that is going to start in 2022 when we have elections, if we have elections, and this is an unstable point in history and we don't know where it's going to go.
Yeah, I think that's another big topic, right? The elections that are coming up. But I think Dr. Solheim, you wanted to respond. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think I entirely agree with Laura and Fabio on this. I just wanted to add one thing. At bottom line is obviously this, that the violence in Colombia just didn't happen overnight. The guerrilla groups they didn't turn into groups just for fun or just because they wanted to become organized crime. They were pushed into it. and they were driven to the point of desperation, right? And if you look at the Colombian history, there's always been a high level of violence, and that comes from poor distribution of land, where the rich elite has always conquered the land which has never been given back, right? So what, and now we are in a really globalized world where Colombia forms part of the international financial system. There is a lot of room for multinationals. I mean, Garcia Marquez in Cien Años de Soledad, he also talked about how the army abused local workers in Colombia in 1920s, 30s. And if you look at that history, that's what always has happened. And what we're now seeing, and the reluctance from the central government, particularly those in power today, and those families around there being supported and aided and pushing forward these policies, are there because they want to ensure or enrich even further their interests, because those are the large landowners, those are benefiting from these multinationals who are really having a party in the natural resource extraction. There is no coincidence that Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil are the countries in the world with the highest ranking where there are most environmentalists and human rights protectors being murdered, right? Because they are threatening certain very, very powerful interests. Unfortunately, these interests are all backed also through free trade agreements, right? So the neoliberal model in place today is not working. It has been failing for a very long time. We saw it already at the mid-2000s when we had the pink tide government in Ecuador, Bolivia, Venezuela, you name it, with Lula in Brazil, after that Rousseff. So you had a push towards left, and that's I think that Fabio has a really important point here. I don't think much is gonna change either before the elections next year, and that is I think the only way also to legitimize a central government, a national government, because what they're not going to do, they're just going to continue stalling the entire thing. Things are going to become more frustrated. Violence is going to continue happening, and without outside pressure, I don't think much is going to change. And they have always used this, you know, the Latin American QAnon conspiracy. You know, you have this in the US, it's blown over to Europe, and in Latin America, it's Castro Chavismo, or this is the fault of Hugo Chavez. No, Hugo Chavez passed away years ago. Or this is the fault of Fidel Castro. No, he also passed away. You know, even in the US election, they blamed the loss, the Republicans blamed the loss, they tried at least, on Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez. And this is something, this rhetoric, this narrative has been taken by right-wing governments in Latin America, because they want to defend this neoliberal model. The problem today is that we all have smartphones, even the poorer segments of society, and other types of information come, and now we are all of a sudden informed. That's also why I think part of why you see this immense explosion, because people are fed up, and I think also that they have lost their fear. That is also why they come in the front line against the military and police today. So I think at the bottom line, we are talking here about defending something that's been in the wrong hands, maldistributed from hundreds of years back in time. Yeah, that's what I wanted to add.
Yeah, Fabio, did you want to respond to that?
Yes, I just want to add something like that is quite important that Dr. Solheim mentions about the use of conspiracy theories. They use it because they don't have anything else to try to justify it. It is hollow, you know? So it's like, look, an ovni, because they don't have anything else to use. Because if you check the evidence, all the countries in the world are printing money to try to get away from the pandemic. The IMF and the World Bank is saying we need good health and education. So, and there's the FARC is no longer there because it's demobilized. Now it's even called differently, commoners, comunes. So that guerrilla group is not there. So they're just like resorting to the excuses of a 4-year-old to try to say a problem is there when it's not there. And the problem is not a problem. People is wanting democracy. People is wanting health, education. They're not asking anything extremely radical. They're asking to fulfill the mandates of an already written constitution in 1991. They're just saying like follow your words with actions. That's the only thing they're asking.
Yeah, speaking about conspiracy theories that fit into the right-wing agenda. An observation of the protest was also that the ex-president Álvaro Uribe, Laura, you've mentioned him before, is very present actually when you look at the slogans that people post, for example. So which is something that I personally also stumbled over, because I think in a German protest you would probably not necessarily see someone bringing up an ex-chancellor. So yeah, I would like to ask, what is the role of Álvaro Uribe in Colombia's current political reality? And particularly, what role does he play in the protests? Maybe Fabio or Laura, if you would like to respond to that.
Go ahead, you wanna go ahead, Fabio?
Well, I mean, if you want, I'll go. If you want, you go. I mean, I'm fine either way.
Okay, I'm gonna start saying very short things about Álvaro Uribe Vélez. He's a myth. His personality and the scope of the influence that Álvaro Uribe has is almost religious. Yeah, he represents an ideology that many Colombians have, that it's not only related to the far right wing and also landowners and all these paramilitary ideals, but it's also related to a certain part of the population in the country that were attacked by the guerrilla organizations such as the ELN or FARC, you know, because the relationship that the FARC and the ELN had with the population, it pretty much depended whether the FARC were belonged to a town or if they were pursuing a military expansion strategy that they did. So there are many sectors in the Colombian society that support Álvaro Uribe Vélez. So why is he so popular? He arrives in 2002, while the country was being labeled internationally as a failed state. So the last presidency of former President Pastrana a couple of years ago had held the worst peace conversation process with the FARC guerrilla when he demilitarized a zone almost as big as Switzerland just for the conversations. And what did the result was? Nothing, just a military strengthening of the guerrilla. Apart from that, we have this narco-paramilitarism rising up in the country, and the paramilitary backlash that the Movimiento Muerte Secuestradores, which was basically a gathering of drug cartels trying to pursue a violent strategy in cities to fight communism, or to fight everything that mirrored communism. So we had terrorist attacks in the cities, we have violence in the rural areas, we had a that was military so strong and in the middle of the country. So he comes here with this messianic proposal of being the one, and this is quite common of all Latin American presidents and Latin American populism, that they believe they have the solutions and the answers for everything. What was the solution and the answer for President Uribe at that time? He was, okay, let's gonna fight the FARC guerrillas, we're gonna pursue a military strategy, we're gonna get some money from the US on the war on drugs, and we are going to use was the policy, a state policy of using paramilitary forces to fight along the regular military forces against the guerrillas. And yes, he did fight FARC, and the FARC retrieved to some of the departments, but at expense of what? At expense of high levels of violence, at expense of the army. The paramilitaries committing a lot of massacres, and the false, how would you translate, guys, the false positive is just the army killing civilians and presenting them as guerrilla combatants. It's just the consequences that the military strategy that Uribe pursued has had a lot of negative impacts in the country in terms of violence, but at the same time, half of the country still regards him as the chief and commander, because he's the chief and commander. I mean, he already chose former President Juan Manuel Santos, but the problem that he didn't see is that Juan Manuel Santos ended up with a very strong political base to oppose President Uribe, and this is a thing that current President Ivan Duque doesn't have. He doesn't have any political backup. He doesn't have any political career. So he is a person that can follow Uribe's orders. And this is well known, and this is an unspoken secret between Colombian society. We know that Duque is not the president. The president is the one who's sitting behind.
Yeah, Fabio, did you want to say something about the question as well?
Yes, I think that, I mean, I'll try to add a couple of things in addition to the great introduction that Laura made. I think something that is important when we talk about the figura of Uribe is like he's more of a symbol than a single character. So he embodies a lot of things. And I think in a way we need to understand Uribe not in the context of Uribe of the 2000s, but his whole history. You know, I mean, it's almost like a soap opera. His dad was killed by guerrillas. Then he was the mayor of Medellin when Escobar was alive. Then he became governor of the province of Antioquia, which is one of the most violent provinces in the country, where paramilitarism grew a lot. And in a way, his career kind of followed the expansion of paramilitary forces in the country. It's not that he is paramilitarism, but he has not rejected paramilitarism, and his actions have taken place as the same way as paramilitarism has expanded in the country. We cannot bring the direct causality between Uribe and paramilitarism, but he's extremely close. He's sort of like the missing link, because he has been associated with a lot of people who were later found to be connected with paramilitarism, but according to law, he hasn't been found guilty yet. So without that evidence, we cannot claim that fact. However, his ideological stance has been clearly a right-wing discourse. When he was a governor in the province of Antioquia, he promoted private armies. For those who are not acquainted with the notion of paramilitarism, private armies is like someone decides to get people with guns to fight guerrillas. And this is not the police, it's not the state. It's someone who has enough money to buy guns. And unfortunately, if you're used to use violence and use guns, and you think you have enough resources to mobilize people, maybe you're connected with the wrong kind of people, right? So in general, what we see is that these paramilitary groups and the laws, because it was enacted into law for several times in the history of Colombia, not only in the 90s, but in the 60s, allow legal groups, drug traffickers, and dark organizations to formalize not only their armed groups, but also their relationship with state forces. And that's why Uribe is so important, because he has been sort of like the ideological glue that has given legitimacy to some of these organizations. He is and remains an extremely important character in Colombia. He might not be popular according to recent polls, but he was extremely popular when he was elected. And something to understand there is that like one of the reasons why Uribe was elected is because a lot of the people was tired with what the guerrillas were doing and with the increase in violence. Not only the guerrillas, but paramilitaries. Colombia observed an escalation of violence from the 90s to the mid-2000s that was shocking. Back then, Colombia had more internally forced displaced people in the world than anyone else. If there was a World Cup of violence against your own citizens, we were winning it, unfortunately. So that kind of like set the background for Uribe. And in a way, he has been like extremely influential because he managed to change the constitution to be re-elected in 2006. That shows that he's an incredible political operator. He managed to get someone elected that wasn't charismatic at all, that was basically a dolphin into presidents 2010, as Laura mentioned, Santos. But Santos was like outsmarted him, but he had enough power. Santos was the grandson of a former president. He was associated with one of the main newspapers and capital in Colombia. So he had enough specific way to balance his power against Uribe. And basically his presidency was pretty much fighting against Uribe. And I wouldn't be sure to say that Uribe's stance was because he didn't want the peace process in Colombia, but I think it's like it's a discussion between like the vision of the country, you know? Peace, he understands it as appeasement, not as participation, not as citizenry. Whereas we don't know if Santos wanted this or not, but the peace process opened a door for that, right? Santos being a dolphin from the elites, and within his own governments, Santos was extremely unpopular and he faced a lot of protests, interestingly enough, from the right, from the radical right that rejects the human rights of LGBTIQ communities, but also from the left. People who were supporting the peace process, like went to the streets, the indigenous people, they opposed Santos. But Uribe was able to coalesce all that discontent that was brewing because there's no health, there's no education, like the economy is growing, but not for everyone, you know? And Uribe was able to mobilize that, and to an extent, Uribe helped inform mobilizations because it made them at some point a little bit more legitimate with the police forces before 2018. But now he's coming back and he's trying to legitimize new discourses to give space and political capital to the government. Uribe now is sticking with Duque because Duque is a sinking ship. But if the ship sinks, Uribismo loses power, and losing power implies exposing Uribe himself to go to jail. So he's basically defending for his political life. And I think like my reading of it, he's also like fighting to defend his legacy. But he's fighting against history, and nobody can fight against history. So he's just like, it's who gets tired. History of him. And unfortunately, history keeps going forever. Uribe won't last 3,000 years. You know, if he lives for 3 or 4 decades more, sooner or later, history is going to catch up with him. But I think he doesn't want to see his downfall before he passes away. So it's kind of like this, this struggle to try to defend his vision of what he made for the country. Having said that, between 2002 and 2010, he was an extremely popular president because he was fighting someone that like a lot of people were opposing, that were the FARC, and managed some reduction in violence by paramilitaries. But that's a little more tricky and nuanced discussion because the paramilitaries kept operating. They just got formalized and they just like gained access to political power. When Uribe was president, and I close with this, some paramilitary leaders said that they controlled 30% of the Congress. You know, so correlation is not causation, but they seem to be always in the same place. And it's extremely tricky to see, like, I mean, then why don't you explicitly reject those views or protect your own heritage from those views? But I think they're like meshed in really complex and hard to untangle ways, you know?
Yeah, well, thank you, all of the panelists, so much for all the information you shared. Yeah, it really shows once again the complexity of this subject. I think we should maybe take a break of 10 minutes now, and then would be back with a couple more questions that come from Lina, but then also later from the audience. So yeah, thank you so much, and yeah, I'll see you all at 4 again.
Fabio, Dr. Solheim, I guess one of us will have to be the moderator now.
It took a little bit longer. Okay. Anna, you're back.
No, no, I'm here. Nice try, but no.
Oh.
So I hope everyone had a good, short and sweet break. I will take over from here, from Katie, to lead the conversation into what the near future might look like for Colombia. So after having touched on the historical and current context of the violence and the national political situation, I would like to first ask the panelists some more questions about what the future might look like. And afterwards, everyone in the audience will be able to ask their questions. I saw that there was already one question in the chat. So you can join in the second half of this part. So to start off with, I would like to ask Solheim a question, because you said in the first part of the panel that the situation that we see now, you could actually see it as a cocktail of several deep-rooted problems that have led to these aggravated effects and responses: the failure of democracy, the failure of the peace agreement, poor distribution of land. But I was wondering if you see any possibilities for national dialogue in the near future. Do you think that even though we are in this tense, in this tense relationship with government, protesters, civilians, how do you see the possibilities of national dialogue?
Thank you, Lina, for the question. It's difficult. Sooner or later, the national government needs to accept this, because the more this pushes on, the worse the political crisis will become, and at the end, a very poor behaving economy will completely be destructed, and then you really have a problem in your hands, right? So at the end of the day, it seems like it appears as if the national government doesn't understand the country they're governing. I do think they understand it perfectly well. It's just that they don't represent the people. They represent a certain segment of the people, right? You see that in the way they behave, and the only response, we see that in all very populistic right-leaning governments, has been through militarization and first try with police and anti-disturbance unit, ESMAD. And if that doesn't work, as is now happening in Cali, they have entirely militarized the entire city. I think last night, they also removed the civilian subsecretary of security that is right under the mayor of Cali, and they replaced him with a former military commander. So they are militarizing the entire apparatus, which hasn't been done since Rojas Pinilla left the office in '57 with the dictatorship, right? So this is unprecedented, and until now, when you try to answer violence with violence, the only thing you will have is just more violence. I was taught this by my mother. I had a fight in school when I was a very young boy, and I mean, it's basic, right? It's common sense. We can't continue hitting each other, and that is why at the very end of the day, they will get rid of their stubbornness. It's just that I think, as Fabio and Laura also mentioned in the first half here, that Uribe is pushing behind. And since 2002, the entire democracy has been militarized, particularly through the democratic policy, the security democracy, the Seguridad Democrática, the program he had. And he militarized the entire country. Look at in the pandemic, they have given much more money to buy military equipment than they have spent on fighting the coronavirus. So there is a completely misunderstanding if we see this as well, you need to govern the country. You need to run this ship in the right course. If not, you're going to end up on the shores, right? So in that sense, they will have to do that. I think they have shown the Colombian government by the international community. I don't think they have much respect there. I do think they are pushing. I saw Michelle Bachelet now was pushing for this to start negotiating in a serious way from the UN. They have blocked the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights to enter the country, which is incredible if you just put that in a larger perspective. They have saved themselves from all the with the falsos positivos. They have left Álvaro Uribe untouchable in that sense, because these extrajudicial killings, they're now counted officially 6,204 murders of civilians. And that says something, that you have a state that doesn't respect its citizens, right? And this needs to be overturned in a certain moment. So what I think will happen is that here the United States will start pushing a little harder than what they have done until now. And I think that the US has much more impact, because Colombia is very much dependent, particularly this government, on US aid, military, financially, particularly through the war on drugs. Officially doesn't exist any longer, but it pushes in that direction. So in that sense, I think that the US is the player here that will push through. They've already shown that. The thing with the United States is, obviously, after 4 years of Donald Trump, you see that part of the Republican, Marco Rubio and all these Republican senators, they are completely agree with what the government is doing now. So they are very much on that side. So that the thing is that if the US government doesn't take a really hard stance here through the new president, then I don't think much will happen. The EU, the UN, and all these other human rights organizations, they can push and scream as much as they want. But the national government, I think 1 or 2 years ago, they made very much a fool of themselves. They went to the GA, General Assembly, and they fabricated evidence that the FARC was present in Venezuela. They probably were, but that's a different story. The thing is that since they fabricated and they presented this evidence in front of the UN, it tells a lot. And also the thing that they are blocking now international human rights organizations from entering, well, that says enough of their attitude towards the international community, right? And at the end, the UN, what power do they have? It's more symbolic. So I think a big player such as the US will be the only one that pushes this through. That's what, at least how I would my conclusion after having analyzed this. And I really don't think that after seeing this a whole month of this, it will probably continue. It may also be that they are now trying to, bring back the fear in people by putting the military on the streets. Well, they do, but I think that they have been so much pushed into a corner and now they have continued with this for a month. The paro nacional is not just going to disappear now. The pandemic came really well for the national government, because all of a sudden the ball was disinflated for a while, and now we see that it's back because they even pushed them further. When you have a country where in order to save your economy, then you take more money from the poorer segments of society, which 42% of the population are living in poverty. It's almost 22 million people. Can you imagine that? So that is just, it was a cocktail, it was a Molotov cocktail that they throw, and now it has entirely exploded, and they cannot handle any longer the situation. So in that sense, I think the pressure will be too much. At a certain time, they will retreat and will sit down at the negotiation table. And also, I think Álvaro Uribe will realize that he needs to quiet, because he has been also one of those behind this, driving this forward, right? As Laura and Fabio also indicated. So I think it will mean at the end of Uribismo, and I think we need to wait until next year in order for legitimacy to be reconstructed from the state point of view, because the social contract that supposed to exist between the state and civil society At this current moment, it's broken, and they need to start to rebuild that. If not, it would end in total disaster, which is not going to happen. Thank you.
Yes, I also find it very interesting that you brought up well, the international community and their place on the stage, because if you saw maybe the news today, the International Federation for Human Rights published that they want to pressure the government into arresting Duque. So that's a very interesting stance that they're taking, because as you said, Solheim, what is actually their jurisdiction? What is actually their role? And I would also like to hear what Fabio and or Laura think about this, also about the news today, about the proposed or the pressure now to maybe even arrest Duque. Will that happen? Can that happen? What will be the consequences?
Do you want me to answer first? Just shortly, I don't think much is going to happen. There was already a vote in the Senate about removing the Minister of Molano, the Minister of Defense, of all the things that's been going on in the last month with the really poor security management. Where so much police abuse and disappearances of people and violations by police officers, etc., etc. And I don't see. They can say a lot, and they need to go hard out against what is happening. That's also part of their role, but I don't think they have much power to do that. And you have to also remember that the most powerful interests in Colombia, political and financial, many of them are supporting the current government because it benefits them, right? So in that sense, I think that's going to be very difficult. It's very far-fetched, but who knows? It's Colombia. It's very difficult to know what's going to happen next. They're in a really dramatic situation, and yeah, we have to see what will happen. But it's very far-fetched indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. Laura, would you like to respond?
Yes, I pretty much agree with what Dr. Solheim said, and I don't believe that jail is the option. Starting on that point, I don't believe the international community has a lot of strength on what's happening right now in Colombia. However, I do see that, for example, the European Union could put some pressure on the government, because when the peace agreement was signed, one of the preoccupations of the elites, of the Colombian elites, is who's going to pay for that? We're not going to pay for that. And the European Union has economic and financial resources invested in Colombia in the process. So if we want, the European Union can say in the future, if we want to get Europe's money, we need to get compliance on certain standards on human rights. That could be an option to do that. And a second option, it's domestically, because in Colombia we have this tragedy, this tragic irony of being very active on the streets, of social movement going and protesting and so on and so forth. But when it comes to voter turnout, the levels of voter abstention are so high always that, okay, it has roots in the we don't trust political institutions, we don't trust the state. But I think Dr. Solheim mentioned this, nothing is going to happen until the elections next year, because the problems that these social movement and social protests have is that they are short-lived. They constitute a specific moment in history where the demands are intertwined with each other, but when you see possibilities for a national dialogue, the possibilities for change are quite difficult. So I think we as Colombians have a challenge ahead when it comes to voting, when it comes to picking up who's gonna represent us in the political system. Because look at the referendum for peace that happened in 2016. The margin between the yes and the no was quite small, but again, the people that voted were so little. And that happened again in 2018 when we voted the anti-corruption referendum or the anti-corruption popular consult. It was nationally, and 90% of the people voted yes, we want change. We know that corruption is a topic that we need to address by the law, but the number of people who voted didn't even manage to go up the threshold. So as long as we don't change the way in we vote, as long as we don't elect the right people for representing us, it's going to be very difficult to articulate demands only through social protest.
Thank you. I'm also finding it very interesting that you brought up the whole election next year, because that will be a very important moment. I'm wondering what you think about that, Fabio. Would you like to add on to what Laura said or respond?
Yeah, I think like perhaps a little bit of a different view on that, what is going to happen. I mean, none of us can see the future. Otherwise, we will be putting our money into lotteries or Bitcoin or whatever. But I think like what we can do is actually think of possible scenarios. Yeah, then the reality won't be on that kind of like reproducing different scenarios, but it can help us to think what ifs, right? So one possible scenario that we can think and is closer to the case of Colombia is the case of Chile. It started like something little, increasing the fare on metro tickets, that really like upset the majority of the population that was struggling to survive, in spite that in Chile, people seem to have a good income, right? If you take away all the debt that people live in. That's one possible scenario. In that scenario, people resisted for longer when the government was trying to get them tired. And the government was trying to extend this for longer and longer, and people like just stayed in the streets. And I think like the government might be over optimistic about their own capacities, and they might be underestimating the capacity of people to resist after they have been 1 year in the middle of the pandemic, when people have fallen into poverty. I mean, we have spoken about poverty and poverty and poverty and poverty and poverty, but poverty for you guys, think that you have just 60 euros a month for everything, and you survive. So people can resist. And people will resist because people know their power now. And the government and some political actors are trying to put back the genie in the bottle because it's like, oh, citizens in the streets, what is this thing? Democracy, right? The institutions are there. The question is how to channel this. The difference between the case of Chile and Colombia is that Chile is going through a constitutional process that allows participations through different streams to bring a collective process. We had a good constitution, but then how do we create the mechanisms to facilitate these streams of grievances and demands to the state to talk to it? That's and that's like a bottleneck. There's quite like an interesting piece by the former peace commissioner that was involved in the peace agreements of 2016, and he was suggesting we need to build trust. So go from small agreements to big agreements. So you start to de-escalate everything, but this is not going to happen like this. It's going to take time, which I don't think this government can do. And the other scenario that is a little bit more tricky, is more unstable, is the experience of the Arab Spring. We have people who revolt, but you don't know where that's going. It can take us to authoritarian left or authoritarian right. So it's hard to know because history is driven by the agency of individuals, and they can change things, right? Those are the two scenarios. What can it be done? If you really care about this, talk about it, tweet about it, Instagram about it, TikTok about it. Use the tools that you have at your disposal. The US is salient, but it's salient for a reason. Not because like we want to be Latin American GI Joes. It's because 50% of Colombian products get sold in the US, right? So the economics do matter. And the government, if they're not willing to talk, they will talk when their pockets hurt. And something that proves the case of South Africa and the transition in South Africa is pressure from sanctions makes people change their mind. They might not care about, they don't really care about the politics. They just care about their profits. So if you heard their profits good enough, they will be able to say like, yes, actually democracy might be working. So I think it's extremely unlikely, but something like that, for example, increases the amount of taxes that Colombian exports have to pay, will make some sectors in the elites to try to push for dialogue, because you need to create that incentive from within the people in power. Otherwise, they're just gonna be in their own corner, defending themselves, checking their own Twitter channels, their own Instagram channels, their own TikTok, or their own LinkedIn. By the way, the Colombian president has a LinkedIn. I don't know who does that, if you're a president. But the important thing here is to figure out that there's different ways in which this can be mobilized, and it's political and it's economic. Those two things interact. And I think that's the only way the government can change their minds within the next months. And I think like the issue about this is like even with new elections, assuming there's a change in participation and mobilization, which I think there's going to be like a shift, not a dramatic change. The structure still suffers those problems because this is a problem of representation. People doesn't get represented and they don't feel themselves represented. By the way, the peace agreement had a provision to give like seats in the lower chamber for people from the regions that have been most affected by the conflict. What did the current government did? They tried to block that. They tried to sabotage that. It seems like the Constitutional Court is pushing down this to be implemented again, but we'll have to see how far it goes, because currently the current peace commissioner in Colombia is actually someone who was opposing peace in 2016. So it is hard for people to believe that the government wants to listen to them when they do these kind of things. And then they send the vice president / foreign affairs minister to speak in Washington, saying that they respect human rights and they're going to investigate carefully whatever has happened when kids keep losing their eyes. And they're beaten and abused and mistreated and accused of being guerrillas. And then you have citizens or people in plain clothes next to police officers. I'm not lying to you, Google that, shooting at people. So I think for the way I see it is sanctions, 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 sanctions. Even if, I mean, and this is sanctions for democracy. We're not trying to bring Belarus here. People just want to be able to be heard. Kids want to have a job. Kids want to study. They're not asking anything revolutionary. They're asking rights in the 21st century. And I think that's kind of like the dilemma that like Colombia faces now. It's a junction. One hopes it goes in the best way, but if not, we need to understand that this is a long-term process, you know?
Yes, thank you. And also building on the last thing you said about people, especially young people, like also Dr. Solheim said, are demanding their future. And on that note, I would like to open up the discussion because I saw that there was a question in the chat that actually also relates to what we are talking about right now. I don't know if Andrés, who posed the first question, would you like to come up here and elaborate on your question for the panelists? I don't know if he's still here. But the question was, what political tools can be articulated to meet all the needs shown by the demonstrators, by the demonstrations? So I think this is also more of a question, more of a bottom-up question. At least that's how I interpret it. Maybe Laura, would you like to start with answering that one?
I think it's a very complicated and complex question from the start. What kind of political tools have to be used in order to meet? Can you repeat the question again?
Yes, of course. So what political tools can be articulated to meet all the needs shown by the demonstration? So actually, how can people articulate their needs in such a way that they will be listened to, or there will something will happen? What do you think?
So let's break it down, because we can't use all political tools to meet all the needs that the protesters have right now, because for that we would have to speak for over a year about several political tools. But perhaps, and this is quite important, from the government side, the political tools, or more the tools, the policy tools they can use to reduce the violence. Because here, as many of you have said, we are in a very dangerous moment in Colombian history. So we come from a peace agreement in 2016, and before that we've been in an armed confrontation between the guerrilla groups, between like a part of the population that are demanding social rights, land rights, and all that thing. So basically what we have is that for more than a half of Colombia's history, we have been dealing with social demand in a violent way, right? We've been confronting each other with guns, and what the government is, it's basically saying now, using this discourse when the Minister of Defense go to the newspapers and the international media, and they say, no, there's a systematic infiltration of the protests. We have intelligence. We are combating urban terrorism. When you keep on saying that, and when you endorse the police forces to commit human rights abuses, when you tell the police forces that you're not repressing a protest, but you are combating an internal enemy, when you militarize the cities and tell the military to do something that they're not trained for, then you are sending the message, and I think Fabio elaborated on this sufficiently. You're sending the message of you can't solve things in a peaceful way, because every time, and this is the goal of social protests, right? To demand social change on the street, to put pressure on the political system for social change. But when you send the message of you can't do that passively, and when you go to the street and people get killed for demanding their rights, then you're sending a very dangerous message. So I think that one of the tools that the government have to do is de-escalation of violence. And for the de-escalation of violence, for me, you have to demilitarize the cities, because you can't fight protesters with military. Second of all, for me, when Fabio and Dr. Solheim were talking about the SMAT, this specialized unit for controlling public disturbances and riots, they can't be the first answer to any protest, because we are seeing this is not new. This is not 2021. This has happened along the country's history. When you confront protest with the first line, with a squad, or with a unit that has specialized in violence responses, then you escalate. And as Dr. Solheim's mother said, when you are met with violence, you respond with violence. So violence and the SMAT can't be the first answer to protest. Then there's a lot of things that can be said here. I'm just going to focus on this de-escalation in a short-term period of time, because it's just too broad to speak.
Yes, thank you. But I think you put that very, very concisely, seeing how complex the situation is. I see that Solheim, Dr. Solheim, would you like to respond? And then I'll go to Mariana Spijkers.
Yes, thank you. Look, I think it's really basic to implement new or mechanisms or political tools. The mechanisms are there, the tools are there. The Constitution 1991, I mean, it's a really beautiful, I've read it several times. And you have all there is on paper, it's fine. It's just that it's not being respected, right? You have a government the political leadership, they're not interested in sitting down and negotiating. I mean, there they have the perfect opportunity. The Paro Nacional, those who are now trying to negotiate, open a dialogue with the national government, they are standing there and there's kind of a show going on, and they don't represent all these different demands from the public. But you have to start somewhere. And the first step of a government is to show that you are serving your people, not yourself. But this is the thing, they have turned the state into their using their own tools, right? Into benefiting their own positions. And if you don't comply with it, it's the same with the police. It's supposed to serve and protect, as the US police always say. It's a really poor example these days to talk about the US police, but you need to show concrete results. And if you don't even want to talk, and you stigmatize and you criminalize those who protest, well, then at the end of the day, you're going to have a civil war. It's been happening so often that history will show that very often that is the case. And particularly now that it has reached such a moment that it's about to really explode. I am very afraid. And then you also need to show concrete results. I mean, they've been crying out loud for so many times to demobilize ESMAD, the anti-disturbance policy. They are trying to, they also cry for reforming the police. The police in Colombia, Policía Nacional, has been reformed, been subject to reform since 1993, when the Gaviria government said that enough is enough. A little girl of 3 years of age, she was violated in a police station in downtown Bogota that year, and then the government said enough is enough. Reform was implemented. Reaching 2 years later, 1995, nothing has happened. In 1995, brick riot again. Well, we're going to implement a serious reform. The police leadership will now take control, blah, blah, blah. And we're at this moment, and what do we see? The thing is that it has been entirely militarized. The police belongs to the Ministry of Defense, as the only in Latin America. They need to remove that. You need to create local units, police units that respond to civilian leadership, acting in not a repressive but in a preventive way. And you need to have that civilian leadership, elected officials, being head of police in Latin America, in Colombia, because if not, the police will continue from receiving their commands from high-ranking officers in the central command, and they would just go about it. I've been researching the case of Bogota for many years, and what you see there, the police is not even, many times they're not even interested in listening to the mayor. Look at what is happening now with Claudia Lopez. She is a woman, she is a homosexual, and she represents a much more leftist-leaning political interest, right? And what is happening with the police? The central command, they don't even want to talk with her. Same with Gustavo Petro. I talked to the police commander when Gustavo Petro was mayor, and they don't even communicate. Well, according to the constitution, I don't know which section it was, sorry, but according to the constitution, the mayor in every plus 1,400 municipalities in Colombia, they are boss of police. So they're supposed to be the same kind of thing that we have here in Europe and also in the US, where the mayor is the head. And that is the only way in a democracy. You can't have the Ministry of Defense dictating things. You can't have that in a democracy. They are supposed to serve the people. And if that doesn't change, which they tried during the 90s, I mean, they had the kind of demilitarization of the entire security apparatus. You had community policing in place, and things they started to really reduce the homicide rate in the cities. Bogota under Antanas Mocus, Enrique Peñalosa made a perfect example of what is possible when political leadership actually take responsibility for in their positions, according to the constitution. But as long as you have politicians that are not interested in that, well, then you can have as many mechanisms as you want, but nothing's going to happen, I'm afraid.
Thank you. I will go to Mariana now, because she has been waiting for quite some time. Mariana, would you like to come up here? Yes.
Yes. So first of all, hello. It's very nice to see you all and hear you talk about Colombia, because So I'm half Colombian, half Dutch, and this is definitely a topic that it's on my mind, and I'm constantly thinking about it and talking about it. Like Laura was saying before, I'm really happy and excited to talk about these. But also, I think this is also a very sentimental subject, right? So I find it very interesting on how something political can be so strong on a sentimental and emotional level. And I feel it like proper strong, you know, and I try to be neutral about it, but I also think, whoa, if I see myself younger and I see all these young people going to the street, how are they feeling? And I can only think about the anger and the fear and the angst and all these emotional things that are leading to them to think, you know, there is no tomorrow. I'm just going to protest. And I think this is definitely a part of what's leading the protest. And I think this aspect, this little emotional aspect, it's more big than what you would think. So I want to elaborate a little bit on this. And before I ask my question, I have written it here. But first, I want to go back to what Solheim was saying. If, for instance, a mom is being violent to his child, the child will react violently, right? So how do you discipline a child who's just hit you very hard because you didn't give him an ice cream? You just don't hit back. You explain, hey, at dinner you have your ice cream, or after dinner. So if there is violence at the family level, and I wonder how this is in Colombia, I don't know, imagine how that affects at the political level. So I think that there is a behavioral aspect in many years of political violence at the families who have politicians, the elites, the police, the people who don't have many resources, the migrants who are displaced and just migrated because there is violence in the rural area. How do they internalize or not or reject violence, right? And how does that affect the younger people? So that's for me, you know, the key aspect of how violence can be or should be resolved if we're to resolve it, right? And that also goes hand in hand to a question that I was asking myself, and I know the answer. Is it legal to protest in Colombia? I mean, there might be laws, I don't know, but it's not, because there's activists being killed by it. So yeah, if activists are being killed because the police is violent, how can we stop violence? How can violence be stopped? And I go back, you know, it's a behavioral issue. But would, for instance, like Fabio was saying, hey, what about sanctions? Would the EU or the US implement sanctions so that export will be reduced? Well, would that help to pressure the state to be less violent against the citizens? Or would, you know, the citizens, the state need to think about the deeper level of how to make policies that are more not violent? So those are the questions that I have, but I also catch on something that Fabio was saying, like, hey, you know what, the world is printing money in order to deal with the pandemic. And I think, yes, the US is printing money to deal with the pandemic, that's true, but to the cost of inflation. So how would the Colombian state deal with inflation? That's a question that I also have. And why did the ley tributaria law, why did that law did not tackle the elite? That's a question, honestly, I don't know. Like, this is a question that I would like to know. Why did the tax law did not think first, let's tax the middle class, and why didn't they decide to tax first the elite? And I think that the answer is because they were taxed before, but I want you, the expert, to let me know, if possible, what's your academical input on that, because I don't know. That's the
Thank you.
I don't know. Before I end, that's the last one, to which I conclude the whole mumble jumble of thoughts. And this is the real question: which behavioral strategies can be used to have or have been used in other countries or societies to demilitarize and to stop the behavior of violence. I think about South Africa. I think about India. I think about Brazil, because Brazil also had like well, a lot of militarized problems in the past. Or
Fabio?
Germany.
Oh, sorry.
To say, yeah. So those are my questions.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you. I think, Fabio, you are the person.
I will try to address this, and I'm going to be really brief. So please excuse me if I don't answer everything. I think there's different things that we need to talk about. The first one is about emotions. Emotions need to be acknowledged, but we need to be aware that emotions can be weaponized. Emotions were used in Colombia to trick people into voting against a peace agreement, right? Emotions can be used to justify violence from both sides of the spectrum. And the thing about legitimacy and violence is once violence kicks in, politicians don't have to worry about the legitimacy gaps, because the government would be defending all the Colombians from violence. And the armed groups that emerge will defending the people on behalf of the rest of the nation. So that's something that we need to be extremely careful on how this is crafted. Something that is important to think about it when we think about emotions and violence, and I think feminism gives us a framework of reference for that, is to think how violence takes place. This is not a Colombian phenomenon. If you see what the Dutch settlers made in South Africa, or what people from the US made in the Philippines, and we can keep going with the North, there's something that is not specific to one country. So we need to be aware of that. And this is not to do gaslighting, saying here and there and whatever, but it's important to consider what mechanisms are there and what we choose to see. People is protesting mostly peacefully, and the majority of the police officers are trying to behave. Some of them are not. The thing is, like, you need to weed out both sides to allow the majority of the people to engage in a conversation, because there's no way the country can work with armed drugs, illicit armies, and so many security demands as in the Colombian state without a police force. The forces need to be reformed and fixed, but it cannot be without forces, because people that has used violence might use the power vacuum to gain power. They have done it before. They know how to play this game. They're more cynical than what we are. And then, like the last one, I'm just going to talk about the reform. The government between 2018 and 2019 gave a lot of tax exemptions. Funny enough, in the reform that triggered the protest, there was the proposal to increase taxes and a wealth tax for people who were earning more than $1.something million, with a lot of exemptions. You know, the majority of the people that has a lot of money wouldn't be taxed because they know how to play the system. I think what broke the camel's back is that, like, this reform actually managed to get different sides of society against one reform imposed by the government. The National Association of Industrials was opposing this reform. The industrials in Colombia were saying before the protest took place that, like, take out the exemptions from 2019. No worries, we'll pay for this, you know? But the government lacks the perspective to see itself from a distance and lacks the leadership to tell the people, chill out, calm down, let's talk. And the thing is that you need a leader in Colombia that speaks to both sides. And that's what is tricky, because we have become more and more polarized following the ideas of the US, right? So we need a healer. But I don't think that is going to happen in one person. That can happen in local spaces, in the same way as people want to defend the human rights of activists. You cannot wait for the EU to do something. You do something. Otherwise, what you're in this world, you need to own your own agency. Protest patriarchy, protest exploitation, wherever you think is unfair. That is what we need to do. And we do it from the lenses and the approaches that we can tackle. You know, if you do a blog, you do a blog. If you do videos, you do video. If you do TikTok, TikTok. If you want to talk to people in the middle of the street, go for it. You will feel fulfilled as a human being. But I think, like, we cannot expect diviners or healers to heal a whole country. The whole country needs to learn this, and it's going to be a painful process. There's no way out of it. But it might be that after that process, we might be birthing a better society.
Thank you. Thank you. I see that David has a question. David, would you like to pose a question to the panel? And afterwards, I'll go to...
Yes, but I thought Laura wanted to react on the...
Yeah. You're muted, Laura.
Sorry, I wanted to say a small comment on the last question that was posed, like what behavioral strategies can be addressed, because it is true that it is not only about a conflict, but it's the Colombian society has militarized, right? Like we have a socially constructed tendency for violence, to solve conflict with violence. And to this point, I really believe that what can help is when we look at the systems of transitional justice in Colombia, the role that true commissions and reconciliation commissions can have in the country. It's more important than the state wants it or that the state believes it to be, because the way we talk to each other, the way we address our history, it matters, because we need to, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how ideology are you are living in the same land. You are part of the same community. You're part of the same political community. And it doesn't help if you're protesting, then you're called a terrorist. But if you are wealthy, then you're called a fascist. It doesn't work that way. So the role of these true commissions, these reconciliation strategies that are part of the broader transitional justice processes, they have to be strengthened in the country. I would say, unfortunately, as you already said, the government doesn't believe in the peace process right now, but it's a thing that we can work on as a society. And yeah, that's just that very small point to the last question.
Yes, and a very important addition, indeed. David, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, loud and clear. Let me put on, okay. Well, I want to start out with saying hello. Thank you all for your insightful information. It was very informative for me as well. I've been following a little bit of the situation, of course, as a Colombian myself. But yeah, a lot of information from you experts was very insightful. Yeah, I have a few critical points I want to address. In starting particularly with the situation in Cali. The situation in Cali has been militarized and is being presented to the international public as a bad thing, right? Like as something that shouldn't be done. But however, I think they are also forgetting the real situation in Cali, because I mean Cali has been infiltrated in the very highest levels of political power by the cartels, or at least that's what my knowledge is about the situation there, where I've been told that some cartels even have so much power in some neighborhoods that people can't even go outside without their permission. So I mean, having said that, I don't agree, definitely not with the solution they are presenting, but I do understand the dilemma that the government is in trying to handle that situation, right? So that was my, and I think that's also kind of is in connection with my second argument, and that is the Pacific protest, right? Because that's what you hear. Like our Pacific protests are being confronted with military violence. I mean, yeah, I totally agree. That's not that there have been some incidents, and they are very repetitive, and there has to be something about it. But I also don't agree with the narrative that has been told that it's only Pacific protests. I mean, definitely in Bogota, where a target of the protests have been police offices, where stations of Transmilenio have been like attacked and totally destructed. So I don't see a lot of Pacific protests in that. So I wanted to know, like, what are your opinions about on these topics, and is there a way? Is it possible to distinguish like the more positive protests from the some level of infiltration that there might be?
Good questions. Thank you, David. Dr. Solheim. Go ahead.
I think here we're touching upon something really at the core of what is the state and the relation between the state and civil society, right? Look, you need to have a police, you need to have an army, you need to have an intelligence agency, you need to have all these things in place. It's not about dismantling the police. Colombian National Police is one of the most sophisticated, most professional police entities in the entire Latin American region. The problem is that when there are violations, when there are police abuse, they destroy their image very soon. And there are problems. I think it's between 160 and 170 or 80,000 police officers forming part of the national police. It's impossible to control the behavior of all these police agents. Some deal in corruption. They have a whole system where they monitor all their police officers, where they are. And if they're not within their territory, they're called immediately by their commanders and they're being asked, what are you doing? There's also a rotation system in place so that they don't stay too long in the same area in order to counter corrupt practices, etc. The police will call this, and you will hear it in Great Britain, in Norway, you will hear it in the US. We have some rotten apples. Every institution has some rotten apples. The problem is that it's a bigger problem than that, right? It's also difficult. So it's kind of blown out of proportion in that way. The professional part of the national police is more in equipment, their capacity to gather intelligence, to meet social demonstrations. So when you need to find a balance here, you need to have preventive and repressive measures. You can't just allow a mob on the street to run wild, right? But the thing is that that part of the police that is provoking is something that needs to be taken into consideration. And as a state, and this is a political issue, because the police is given their commands from the commander-in-chief. Well, I think officially that will be perhaps Álvaro Uribe, but today Iván Duque is officially in the Palacio Nariño, so he is the president, and they respond to a militarized hierarchy. So it's really difficult to find that balance on a local level. And the thing is, when you drive people to the brink of to the point of desperation, you need to expect certain behavior, and some of that is legitimate. Yes, you have organized crime organizations, and they're taking very much advantage of the chaos that is taking place. You have drug cartels, you have former paramilitaries, you have all kinds of different organizations, heavily armed, very sophisticated organizations, very powerful. They're benefiting very much from this, and that needs to take into consideration as well. And there is a tendency to say that to criminalize all these protests, and there are presence of armed groups in these protests, right? So illegal armed actors, obviously there is always, but you can't. What is doing is generalize the entire protest, and what they're doing is to have one response, and that can take place. Take for example the instance of the CAI, los Centros de Atención Inmediata, which are small police stations put out, for example, in Bogota. They have been very much burned. I think of the 176 that are now in place, many of them were burned and they were destroyed by protesters. But much of that comes from people that have received, for example, police abuse, or they have been fined for whatever reason because of the pandemic, etc., etc. The amount of penalties issued from the police, such as fines, has increased 500% during the pandemic. So people don't look. This is the problem. People don't look at the police as legit. So I've been looking at police patrols. I've also been walking with them on the streets in Bogota, and there is, when you have such a low level of trust, people don't listen to the police. The police have certain powers. If you resist an arrest, they can use force. and they will never be sentenced for it, because it's part of the constitution. That's part of the social contract. I give a part of my privacy, and you protect me. This is obviously where it starts to go wrong. So when a police officer abuses his or her powers, obviously this is very then easy. And today we see that all over in YouTube. You see police harassment and all that. And it's not the entire police, obviously, but the police has also, they act in a very complicated situation. They have very long hours, and it pushes a human being into violating the law in a very easy way, and the step from acting in a preventive way to start using violence is very, very short. This got to do with police officers. They're particularly those who are really facing hardship, in the sense of they're patrolling the street and they're facing all these protests, and they need to defend each other. And you have all these different components that are really important that we take into consideration. It's not like the entire national police are bad and they're there to protect only political interests, for example, but it's a very difficult situation where they have a national government implementing extreme measures, and they are trying to then balance this with not using too much repression, and also trying to you can't just, for example, you can't allow a protest of 100 people paralyze a city of 6 million. That's not the case. I've spoken a lot to the former Hugo Acero, who was a former subsecretary of security in Bogota, and protesters also, sometimes we need to recognize that they don't behave well. Some don't, but the situation, the political situation, have pushed them so much into a situation where it's really not easy to handle them, and then it's blown out of proportions, and the only thing the state then does is to militarize the entire thing. So we need to find a balance here, and the
I will sorry, Dr. Solheim, I will stop you because Fabio actually almost has to go, and
sorry.
and he has his hand up. So Fabio, would you like to respond?
Yes, thank you for everything, because after this I have to go. But I wanted to mention two things related with what has been mentioned by my fellow panelists, and it's like the link between legitimacy and leadership. Not even Uribe, after thousands of citizens were killed by armed forces, because this is a fact. I mean, we can disagree about the numbers, but thousands of citizens were killed, civilians. Not even Uribe wore a military or a police uniform after abuses took place. What the current government has done is, when there has been reports of one policeman shooting in the head an unarmed citizen, the president of the republic comes the next day wearing a police jacket, as opposed to saying, like, we condemn this action. This is not the police we want in our country. So of course, that lack of leadership is driving further polarization. And that comes to my second point. We're living in the age of social media. And that makes it extremely tricky to distinguish between the data and the noise. So if I like conservative policies, I'm Catholic, I'm going to be shown certain videos. If I'm atheist and I like communism, I'm going to be shown certain videos. So we need to be aware of that we're being fed particular kinds of information that fits into particular narratives, right? Something that I would raise a point of concern just for reflection is the equivalence between property and life. A building, I don't know how many lives a building is worth it, but I think there are different units of measure. So we're talking about citizens that have been killed, police officers as well. So I wouldn't get into the discourse of comparing lives with buildings, because I don't think you make societies out of that. You don't make societies out of contracts for construction. You make societies out of social contracts for respecting life. And I think that this is where both sides need to be clear about, that the center premise is life and how we move forward. And that's something that is contentious, because, as we said, politicians and opportunists and some people that don't like the idea of peace in Colombia will try to push violence because it suits their agendas, going from drug traffickers to corrupt elites in both sides of the spectrum, right? And to be fair, a lot of the regions in Colombia have suffered the influence from drug traffickers. But because a province had drug traffickers and cartels, that doesn't mean that when you're asking for bread, you're obeying the cartel orders. I've spoken with people in Cali, and what is interesting now is that, in fact, those gangs are quiet for some reason. Because they know, like bringing public attention to their business is not convenient for drug traffickers, right? So be careful of using a big generalization to equal protesters who are opposing police violence, that is the majority, with the ones who burn stuff, with drug traffickers, and with the police that actually does their work well and de-escalate tensions, because that is happening. So that's something that we need to be careful if we want to help to solve the problem. If we want to make it burn, then you just put fuel and light it up. But we need to be careful of how we talk and what we try to inform ourselves with in order to be able to construct and help constructing solutions. And that implies the left and the right and the center. It doesn't matter. It is facts. So the only thing we can do to solve this is to have evidence. And that's facts. It's not opinions. It's facts. I don't care what I think about drug traffickers and guerrillas. It's just like, if the guerrilla kills people, that's bad. If the government kills people, that's bad. If the drug traffickers kill people, that's bad. If the protesters kill a police officer, that's bad. Otherwise, we enter this game of justifying violence for violence. And we have thousands of deaths that have proven where that takes us. So that's something out of a concern. You guys are awesome. I have to bail out, but you're owning your citizenry. Wherever you are, whatever you want to do, go for it. You know? Ciao, ciao.
Thank you, Fabio. Thank you for being here. And he's gone. I think we will close the panel on this note. Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you, Håvar, for sharing your perspectives, your knowledge with us today. I also want to thank everyone who posed a question, who joined the conversation. And it was really interesting. And I think we all will leave with a more a broader sense of what is happening, and also just a more a more elaborate and nuanced view on the situation. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much. I think it's really important that you organize this event, because you need to shed light on this. It's a very dramatic situation, and let's see. Let's hope for the best in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thank you all for coming.